Hi, I'm David Gregg, the director of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, and you're watching a recording of the May meeting of the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership. My apologies for this taking so long to get up on our YouTube channel. This meeting took place almost 6 months ago. This month's focal presentation is by Caitlin Littlefield of the Vermont-based Conservation Science Partners, a kind of consultancy that provides actionable climate resilience and management research. Caitlin's going to use a wildlands and woodlands frame developed by Harvard Forest to look at the way we here in the Northeast use wood resources. The title of her presentation is Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, and she's going to take the position that by using more wood here in the Northeast than we produce, we're essentially exporting the negative consequences of wood forest product production to other places. The Rhode Island Woodland Partnership is a collaboration among foresters, landowners, conservationists, and managers to advance the stewardship and long-term protection of Rhode Island's woodlands for the benefit of the local economy, ecological values, and community enjoyment and health. Now, the Woodland Partnership has lots of activities scheduled for the coming months, and I hope you will join us for those as we post them here on our Rhode Island Natural History Survey YouTube channel. The Rhode Island Natural History Survey presents videos to showcase the animals, plants, geology, and natural systems that surround us, and the people and organizations working to understand and conserve them.
All right. Well, welcome to the May 2024 Rhode Island Woodland Partnership meeting. And got a good group today, and we're happy that Caitlin Littlefield of Conservation Science Partners is with us today. And she's going to share with us the Beyond the Illusion of Preservation study and report, of which she's an author. And just before leading into that, why don't we go around as we typically do and just introduce ourselves to give Caitlin some idea of the partnership. I'll start out. I'm Christopher Riley with the University of Rhode Island and Sweet Birch Consulting. I'm the co-coordinator of the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership with Kate.
Hi, everybody. Kate Sales, the co-coordinator of Woodland Partnership and the director of the Land Trust Council. I'm going to pass it on to Rich Blodgett.
Good afternoon, Rich Blodgett. I'm with Providence Water, and I'm involved with the Watershed Management Program. Amanda?
Good, I was muted, sorry. Amanda Freitas, Rhode Island Wildlife Action Plan Community Liaison. I'm going to pass it to David.
I'm David Gregg. I'm the director of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey. Mark Tremblay, are you out there?
Yes, I am. I'm not sure if I'm muted or not. I'm on my phone here.
Nope.
So Mark, what's your role?
Can you hear me though? I'm not sure if I'm okay. All right. I'm Mark Tremblay, represent the Rhode Island Forest Conservators Organization. I'm a forester. Thanks.
Thanks. Let's go over to Brendan.
I'm Brendan Buckless. I am the Rhode Island Forest Legacy Coordinator, and I will kick it over to Sam.
Everyone, I'm Sam Tebow, and I'm the Land Conservation Program Manager at the Northern Rhode Island Conservation District. I will pass it to Deanna.
I'm not sure that Deanna has audio. No, Mike. She is a state lands forester with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, perhaps out in the field this afternoon. And I think finally we've got Melissa.
Hello, Melissa Hayden. I'm a biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Rhode Island.
Thanks, everyone. So that's a good sampling of Woodland Partnership members. And Caitlin, we'll turn it over to you from here. You can just tell us a bit about yourself and your work.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. And really nice to meet you all. Thanks for having me and for the chance to come and present on some of this work on behalf of, it's certainly not just mine, but the rest of the teams too. So I'm a senior scientist at Conservation Science Partners, and we're sort of a little almost pseudo consulting group. that provides actionable climate, especially climate change adaptation and conservation research to federal agencies. We work closely with the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, as well as state agencies and smaller conservation organizations, or not so small, but groups like Pew Charitable Trust, Center for American Progress. And so I sort of operate in that role of both doing science, but really helping to kind of co-produce science and translate science into action for land managers and conservation practitioners. And a lot of that work I do pretty closely with folks at UVM, like Tony D'Amato. So I was at UVM teaching and doing research up until a couple of years ago when I joined Conservation Science Partners. So even though the current role I occupy, we span the whole country, I really do feel very rooted here in New England and especially Vermont. And that's why it was so, it's been so fulfilling to be able to work on this particular body of work that's addressing some of the imbalances that we have across New England and maybe some of the hidden trade-offs that we don't always account for when thinking about things like carbon, for example. So with that, I'll go ahead and share this presentation. Make sure, can everybody see that A-okay? Great. Okay.
That's good.
Very good. Thanks, Christopher. But I do want to say, and having this as more of a dialogue, please interrupt me at any point. I don't have all the answers, but I am here to learn from you all, especially, and much of the audience to date for this work has been sort of the northern New England scene. And we do point specifically at southern New England as well as part of that deficit in our wood production needs. And so would really love pushback and discussion and ideas and thoughts as we can hopefully advance this kind of vision for how we might keep New England's forests forested and safeguarding their countless values while also sustainably meeting our resource needs. So again, please interrupt at any point. But yes, so I am here to present this and I've helped lead this work, but I do want to acknowledge the other co-authors here, Brian Donahue especially, and Paul Catanzaro, who was unfortunately unable to join today. But those two in particular, then certainly the rest of the crew were just instrumental in helping get this multi-year effort underway and over the finish line. So before I dig in to the work that we've done, I do want to take a moment to give an explanation for what's a pretty provocative title and to be pretty clear about the legacy upon which we're building. And so that term illusion of preservation, it's not new. It comes from this 20-year-old study out of Harvard Forest that set forth what you see in its subtitle, which is a global argument for the local production of natural resources. And that argument really rested on the paradox that the authors here laid bare. And it was focused at first on Massachusetts and really showed that even though Massachusetts can rightfully be proud of its abundant forests and long history of conservation leadership, as a state, it produces almost none of the wood consumed therein. And so preservation of more wild forests is, of course, crucial, but this original study argued, unless the state, in this case Massachusetts, also addressed the massive volumes of wood consumed and how it's produced, namely importing it from outside of the state borders where negative environmental and social consequences could be ignored, well then that preservation, advancing more preservation, is an illusion. So instead, what this study suggested is that we need to simultaneously advance preserved lands, so intact wildlands, while also conserving sustainably managed woodlands to establish that better balance between our production and consumption. And so following this original publication, and these are maybe reports that you all have seen as well, targets for that balance of wildlands and woodlands took shape, first in Massachusetts, then for New England, and then encompassing farmlands and communities too. And so it's within this context, wildlands and woodlands, that we've returned to that original paradox that this original report laid bare. And we've extended it from Massachusetts to all of New England. And we've stuck with those terms that this Harvard Forest has set forth, wildlands and woodlands, in talking about places that are passively managed, the wild forests, and then actively managed for sustainable production. And so we have been really quite intentional in our own title of retaining beyond the illusion of preservation. And we're keeping that term in quotes for a couple of reasons. So on the one hand, we really want to honor the original work that this report represents and give credit where credit's due. But we also, in keeping illusion of preservation in quotes in our own report, we're really trying to kind of hold it at arm's length as well. And that's because this is a provocative, sassy title. And we are, to be really clear, we're not in our current work in this report. I should have held it up to begin with. We're not trying to cast aspersions on the work of our colleagues who are legitimately and thoughtfully trying to advance important preserved lands as well. We need more big, vast, wild spaces, as well as more passively managed smaller reserves peppered across the landscape. And so what we're really trying to do in our work is show just how imperative and compatible both wildlands, passively managed lands, and sustainably managed woodlands are to meet our wood products needs. So we need both of those, wildlands and woodlands. So that's my little caveat about the title of our work and a bit about the legacy that we're guided by. So if I had to sum up our motivation for revisiting this work, it's really encapsulated in this. The mounting pressures to reduce harvesting, especially on our public lands, to maximize ecological values of forest, and especially the capacity for forests to store carbon. And although Southern New England, and maybe especially Massachusetts, I don't know what it's quite like in Rhode Island. I'd be really glad to hear your thoughts on that. I think in many ways, Massachusetts and parts of Southern New England have been perhaps the epicenter of these mounting pressures. We're really starting to, of course, feel that further north too, in the northern reaches of our regions. And so it is being acutely felt here in Vermont. For example, the picture on the right is the Worcester Range, not far from where I live, where there's much ongoing debate around managing these lands. And so, in many ways, against the backdrop of just unprecedented climate change and breathtaking, heartbreaking biodiversity loss, I do think it's so heartening that we're seeing this growing societal recognition of just how magical photosynthesis and carbon fixation are. And so rightfully so, people are looking to our forests as a crucial natural climate solution. These are land-based pathways that keep carbon out of the atmosphere, and they're really crucial to helping us mitigate climate change while we also absolutely reduce fossil fuel consumption. And forests are right there at the top in terms of being carbon powerhouses, as well as yielding important other co-benefits like supporting biodiversity, clean air, clean water, healthy soils. These are of course things that you all are well familiar with. I won't walk through this precise graph, but this is the documentation of the climate change mitigation potential of a range of natural climate solutions. And again, not to brush aside agricultural lands and grasslands and wetlands, but forests in particular really do hold the key to keeping carbon out of the atmosphere and helping us mitigate climate change. However, I think that a singular focus on maximizing carbon across the board really can obscure any number of trade-offs. They might be ecological. So although, for example, there are many species that benefit from mature old forest conditions with lots of biomass that are loaded with carbon, not to mention countless other ecosystem services, here are a few examples of natural communities on the left that also important habitat for, in many cases, imperiled species, but in which less is more, less carbon is more. So whether that's the pitch pine barrens, whether that's early successional northern hardwood conditions in that center photo, or further west towards the lake states, oak savannas that were historically maintained by frequent fire. In each of these systems and many others, above ground carbon at the stand level is not necessarily compatible, or maximizing above ground carbon at the stand level really isn't necessarily compatible with restoring or maintaining the habitat conditions that a range of taxa require. And that's the stand scale. And then of course, at the landscape scale, maintaining a diversity of conditions like these can ultimately equate to greater adaptive capacity and reshuffling of communities as climate change unfolds, and the reduced risk of carbon loss in the case, for example, of a severe disturbance. So just to put a little bit finer point on that, in this figure that Tony D'Amato compiled, we can see that for these songbirds, the carbon stocking associated with their optimal habitat conditions varies considerably. So if we only focus on maximizing carbon stocking rather than on supporting a diversity of conditions, some of these species may well lose out. Back to just a couple other trade-offs here. In some contexts, higher carbon stocking levels might also contribute to more density-dependent mortality. So whether from moisture stress, insect invasion, or other factors. And in some cases, in some of the forest carbon project protocols that are out there, they might actually incentivize these high levels of stocking that do contribute to greater density-dependent mortality. So in this figure here, we're looking at the frequency of forest inventory and analysis plots, so continuous forest inventory plots by hardwood and softwood in low and high site class that meet or exceed some of the basal area thresholds of a particular carbon project protocol. Those are the ones in orange. And those that don't meet what's required by these protocols are in teal. And what we actually see is more carbon loss, and so greater mortality, that's further on to the right on the x-axis there, in those stands that exceed the thresholds that are called for in these protocols. So once again, this push towards packing more carbon in might inadvertently contribute to even more mortality. And then just a few other final examples. In some contexts, maximizing that above ground carbon could lead to more accumulated fuel loads that increases the risk of higher severity fire. Reduced harvesting in general that can equate with increasing carbon, stand level carbon, whether in the context of a formal carbon project or not, that can have dramatic implications for the local workforce and timber tax revenue. And some of this is playing out in northern New Hampshire right now and some of the other former industrial timberlands of northern New England. And then, of course, as it pertains to our conversation today, reduced harvesting in one place might exacerbate the illusion of preservation if we simply bump our production elsewhere while continuing to consume wood products at the rate we do. So coming back to our public lands then, these, and where much of this debate is playing out about, and the pressures to curtail harvesting in the name of carbon are playing out, I do think this is where some of those potential trade-offs, both ecological and economic, are frequently obscured as we see these pressures to curtail harvesting. So whether that's the moratorium on logging in Massachusetts state lands, to ongoing debates centered on these state lands that I alluded to earlier, Vermont's Worcester Range, this pressure to curtail harvesting is mounting across the region. And we absolutely, just as an author team, on behalf of the author team, we wholeheartedly recognize the value of passive management and support dramatically expanding wildlands, those passively managed wild places, especially as we tackle our climate and biodiversity crises. But again, this strategy by itself is going to fail to provide the full suite of benefits that we seek from our forests, both here in New England and beyond. So if we reduce harvesting within New England while maintaining our extraordinarily high levels of consumption, we're just shifting that wood production elsewhere, including to regions of the world that might have weaker environmental oversight than exists in much of New England. And that leakage is going to do very little to reduce carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere. Again, it simply extends the illusion of preservation. And so that's really what motivated us to revisit that 20-year-old report out of Harvard Forest and extend it to all of New England. So we returned to that original question and asked this: is New England producing as much wood as the region consumes? How about each state? And so I'm going to briefly step through some of the data sets and methods that we use to answer that question, and I'm happy to elaborate more if there are any specific questions about methods. But all told, we took a net balance approach to examine how that production compares to our consumption, and how the recovery of paper and wood products, however small, also fits in that equation. So let's start with consumption. So we first took our consumption estimates for lumber and pulp from some recent national per capita data from the Forest Service's Forest Products Laboratory, and we adjusted those numbers by the median household in each state. As for fuel wood consumption, that's lumber and pulp, but as for fuel wood consumption, we just could not find any reliable data on the amount of fuel wood consumed within New England, and so we simply set that equal to the amount produced. So we're assuming that whatever fuel wood is harvested in a given state, in a given year, that is consumed. So as for production, we explored various data sources, including state harvest reports, which Vermont and Maine in particular maintain on an annual basis. But all told, we elected to use the Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis dataset because that is standardized across states and recent inventories were available. So that's how we got to production. And then this is one final and pretty modest piece of the equation, but it's wood recovery. And so we used published data on the volumes of wood recovered from construction and demolition, as well as from municipal solid waste. And we parsed that mostly into fuel, a little bit into pulp, and a tiny bit into lumber. And across these three buckets, we necessarily made a handful of other assumptions and simplifications. So for example, we're assuming that 2/3 of the average saw log harvested in New England becomes lumber, and the remainder, the sawmill waste, gets allocated to pulp. So there are a couple other simplifications. We lumped hardwood and softwood species, but I won't go into those. Happy to answer any of those questions at this point or later on in the Q&A. So then what we did, we added to our production that recovered wood and then subtracted out our consumption to arrive at where we stand now. So how then are we doing? So all told, as a whole, New England produces about 2/3 of the wood consumed within the region. And so what you're looking on the left, of course, is all of New England. There is production in that left-hand bar and consumption in terms of volume, thousands of cubic feet of wood on an annual basis. So I'm going to add a little bit of nuance to those components. So consumption is parsed into lumber and paper raw materials. And so we've added pulpwood and sawmill waste into that grouping, paper raw materials. Production includes tiny amounts of recovery from waste streams, pulpwood removals, and sawlog removals, which are distributed into lumber and pulp to be used in paper. So again, that's that paper raw material there. And I'm not showing fuel wood in any of these charts because we made that assumption, as I alluded to a minute ago, that those volumes cancel out. So consumption of fuel wood is equal to production of fuel wood. So some, I think, might look at this and say, well, 2/3 is pretty darn good for a region. And I think that, yeah, that could be true. But really, it's the disparities within the region between New England states that I think are particularly striking and that really show how the illusion is operating within New England. So collectively, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island produce well under 10% of the wood consumed in those states, despite being roughly 60% forested. So New Hampshire is closer to parity with regards to its production and consumption, and Vermont produces about half again as much as the state consumes. Maine, though, as you can see, produces upwards of 325% of what the state consumes. And so what that ends up meaning is that for the region as a whole, about 70% of the production comes from Maine, and about 70% of the consumption occurs in southern New England. And in many ways, this is quite logical. There are far more people in the southern parts of our region. But I do think, though, that given the forest cover, the region in general can do more. So we have in New England about 2 acres of forest for every New Englander, and that's roughly equivalent of the ratio of forest land to the people in the US as a whole. And the US as a whole is pretty close to achieving a net balance of its wood production and consumption. And so I think what that means then is that New England can do more. New England can step it up, and perhaps especially southern New England. This imbalance doesn't need to persist. And I think especially in terms of that lumber deficit, we can do far more. We can move beyond the illusion and produce a larger proportion of our wood products consumed here in New England, and we can do it well with a great degree of oversight. And that can help propel us towards meeting some of our urgent regional and state level climate and biodiversity goals as well. Okay, so that's all well and good to say. We can do more, we can do better. Oh yeah, Christopher, please.
A question, I was just wondering, what this might look like for the United States as a whole. Of course, some parts of the country have a lot more forest than others. I don't know how sort of helpful a comparison that is, but just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, thanks. So as a whole, the US is about at net balance. I can't speak to individual states, but certainly you could imagine some states that are don't have great population density, but are hugely forested and have a lot of biomass in them, like, parts of Oregon certainly would have a bar chart that looks much closer to Maine's than other states. But as a whole, the US is pretty close to parity in terms of the US would probably look something closer to New Hampshire. So it's pretty close to meeting that.
Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Any other questions? All right, well, I'll keep charging through here. So what would it take then for New England to move beyond the illusion and sustainably produce as much wood as we consume? We would suggest 3 steps to do so to be achieved by 2060. And that is protecting forests, reducing consumption, and extending ecological forestry. So our first step, protecting forests, is consistent with the framework set forth by the Wildlands and Woodlands group originally. So we are aiming for at least 10% of New England's landscape in wildlands and 60% in woodlands. And so again, those wildlands mean they are passively managed, where we are allowing for natural processes to largely shape the dynamics in the woods, whereas woodlands, humans are going in there a bit more. So on average, the region is losing about 30,000 acres of forest to permanent conversion each year. And that is a pretty worrying loss, given the incredible rebound of the region's forests in the late 19th and 20th centuries. So this is a story that you're likely familiar with, that after decimation of the region's indigenous populations, which is wholly inadequately symbolized by that asterisk in the origin of the figure, demonstrating that no, despite what this graph looks like, there were more than 0 people in New England before the arrival of the settlers. But of course, after that decimation, the settlers steadily cleared the forests of southern and central New England, while the northernmost parts did tend to stay fairly forested and were eventually oriented towards the industrial extraction of timber and later pulp. Then the abandonment of farmlands in the mid-19th century allowed for that rebound of the southern forests in the last decades of the 20th century, at which point our forests have really started to wane in area again. So that decline is due to urban sprawl, low density development, and that I think is one of the more insidious ones, that low density development, which really perforates the forests. So that middle image there is not far up the road from me in Stowe, Vermont. You see those homes just falling up the hills, which really does compromise the intactness and connectivity of the forest. And then another tricky dynamic is the renewable energy development. So a recent Audubon report found that about a quarter of natural land conversion in Massachusetts over a 5-year period was due to solar development. So we have to absolutely deploy more renewable energy, but let's not clear our forests to do so. So if we don't substantially ramp up protections as we're calling for, these forests will continue to be lost. And I think that vulnerability itself is lost on a lot of New Englanders, because many of us can look out the window and just see trees blanketing the hillsides and all around us. So New England is about 80% forested at this point as a region as a whole, but only about a quarter of the landscape is protected from conversion to non-forest. So we really need to urgently decrease the rate of forest loss and substantially increase the rate of those protections. And so again, we're calling for at least 10% of the New England landscape in wildlands and 60% in woodlands. And there are varying, I think, some varying opinions as to the rigidity and the definition of what a wildland should be or can be. Must there be an intent and management secured by permanent easement or legal mechanism, or statutes, well-established policy, or is there a more relaxed vision of what it means to have passively managed areas to meet these targets? But I think for the sake of having targets, sometimes it is important to put those numbers there and draw those lines around places. And so again, I do want to acknowledge that there is importance passively managed places at all scales of this, whether it's an individual legacy tree, a patch reserve, or entire parcels and properties or massive wilderness areas that matter. But for the sake of having these targets, we are speaking about areas that are formally designated as passively managed. Okay, so that's step number 1. Step number 2 is reducing consumption. And to be honest, this is one that I think I'm really kind of the most excited about, even as it just seems pretty impossible to wrest all of our stuff away from us in this world that we live in. But what we're calling for is a 25% reduction in lumber use by 2060. And actually, that's pretty consistent with what the population and housing projections are already suggesting is going to happen. So we do feel this is a pretty reasonable estimate and target. So housing starts and lumber consumption are pretty tightly correlated, as you might imagine, and the region is actually projected to see a slowdown in population growth and housing starts by mid-century, and therefore plausibly a reduction in lumber consumption. That might change if we have another pandemic, if we see a massive influx of climate refugees into the region. But it's a solid, reasonable target, and solid even as we meet our urgent affordable housing needs. And to our chatter before the conversation here today, hearing from Kate about this notion of this conflict between land protection and housing is just, I think that is a false dichotomy that we've got to grapple with. And in many ways, our affordable housing needs can be met with local wood too. So that lower left-hand photo is a multifamily affordable passive energy house in Lewiston, Maine, constructed with local wood with support from a group called Local Woodworks. And it's not just multifamily housing though, it's single family housing. And so a statistic that that blows my mind is this, that in 1975, the average single family house in the Northeast was about 1,600 square feet. It's now nearly 2,800 square feet, even as families have gotten smaller. So I don't know why we need all that more space, maybe just to keep more of our stuff and accumulate stuff, I'm not sure, but there is much room to be gained from reducing the size of our housing stock. So reducing that footprint could mean a further reduction in material consumption. So we're also calling for a 25% reduction in paper consumption too. As the US as a whole, we consume about 4 times the per capita global average of paper. And we're envisioning a reorienting of that lower grade wood to more durable, innovative uses. So towards wood fiber insulation, mass timber, as in this beautiful design building in UMass in the lower right. And in many cases, wood is going to be preferable to other carbon intensive materials, steel, concrete, plastics, polystyrene. And so even though this particular step we're calling for is focused on reduced wood consumption, that same argument is warranted for all types of consumption. So fossil fuels, of course, but plastic, steel, polystyrene, concrete, etc. We are just awash in stuff. And we absolutely ought to be substituting some of that with wood. But across the board, we just need to rein in our material consumption, period. A lot of that stuff ends up in the waste stream too. And so as part of the step, what we're calling for is increasing the recycled content in paper to 50% and increasing our wood reclamation as well from municipal solid waste and construction and demolition. So then the final step then is expanding ecological forestry. And excuse me, let me put some notes here. In a minute, I'm going to talk about just how much acreage it will require to get to meet that reduced level of consumption. But first, let's talk a little bit about what this step means. So drawing directly from Tony D'Amato's textbook, a goal of ecological forestry is to sustain healthy, productive forests with native species diversity and a full array of ecosystem services by managing them in ways that bring them closer in structure, function, and composition to healthy natural forests at all stages of successional development. So we're harvesting wood products, but we're doing so in ways that emulate natural patterns and dynamics while sustaining the full array of ecological values that forests afford. So a focus here then is on promoting natural forest conditions. So large snags, down wood, a diversity of tree species and sizes, canopy layers and gaps, rather than maximizing total yield in the short run. And so what that means is that ecological forestry might not produce as much harvestable wood as rapidly as, for example, intensive plantations or short rotation forestry, but it does produce a steady output of long-lived wood products that are often high market value while protecting other forest values. And so that's why we're seeking to expand ecological forest management. So even so, though, we acknowledge that the expansion of ecological forestry can be challenging in some contexts. For example, on concrete ownerships where high rates of return are expected on shorter time horizons. So it's possible that auxiliary revenue as from forest carbon markets might help. So in the photo on the right there, that's from the Appalachian Mountain Club's Maine Woods Initiative. And some carbon revenue is helping to support the management that's focused on establishing higher stocking and restoring structural and compositional complexity to lands that had been heavily logged in the past prior to AMC's acquisition. But all told, to expand ecological forestry with or without the auxiliary revenue associated with, again, for example, carbon recreation, we're really going to need to see greater consumer willingness to pay premiums for such wood products. And that really does, I think, fit into a broader cultural shift around our relationship with forests that I'll return to. Okay, so we've got these 3 steps then: protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry. So how much wood then could ecological forestry in New England sustainably produce? And how much acreage would be needed for us to meet more of those wood product needs even as we reduce that consumption? So to answer that question, we've applied a pretty broad conservative estimate that by 2060, ecological forestry could produce an average of 0.4 cords of wood per acre per year. And I would love to hear from folks on this call, the foresters on this call, about how that sits, how that rate sits with you all. So 0.4 cords per acre per year, with 60% of that in sawlogs and 40% of that in lower market value wood. So that ratio of 60 to 40 is just about the inverse of what the region yields today. So to meet our wood demands in 2060, we're going to need 8 million cords. And accordingly, that will require about 20 million acres in New England's forest land under ecological forest management, which is just under half of New England's land, or under 2/3 of our forest total. So where then did that 20 million acres come from? So first, the first step, of course, we've withdrawn wildlands, about 10% of New England's landscape into the wildlands. And we're allocating 50% of public land acreage in each state to ecological forest management, 50% of family forest ownerships in each state, and about 100% of corporate lands to active ecological forest management. And again, that is after we've withdrawn 10% of New England's landscape into reserves. So that's 1 million acres in family forest ownership and reserves, 1 million acres from what's currently corporate land, and 2 million from public lands. So this is just one scenario, to be very clear, for sustainably meeting our regional needs. It could take many other different forms. But in terms of our particular model here, let's see how it shakes out with the net balance. So we've reduced consumption. We have increased recycled content and recovery. And what that means then is we're going to see a modest reduction, in fact, in our production. And we're also a reorientation of the lower grade materials to sawlog, saw timber, higher grade materials. So here's what that ends up looking like. What you'll see is that Maine is still a disproportionate producer for the region, but southern New England states are getting closer to producing about 20 to 25% of the wood consumed therein. And as a region, as a whole, we're basically a net balance. And Christopher, to your question earlier, this is about where the US as a whole would sit. So let's compare this then to where we were. So right now we're looking at region-wide numbers. This isn't broken down by state anymore. And what you can see is that our overall consumption has declined pretty dramatically based relative to where we were. And accordingly, as I mentioned a minute ago, production has also seen a modest decline across the region. And I realize that might give some folks some pause, but recall though that we are reorienting production away from lower grade material towards higher grade materials. So we're seeing more sawlog removals relative to pulp in 2060 than we did in 2020. That can represent increased stumpage values and could foster or reinvigorate value-added supply chains in the communities that are oriented around the forest industry. But still, I think that's a topic of conversation to be had as well. What does it mean to see a bit of reduced production? Okay, so that's easy to get there, right? Not so much. So how do we get there? How do we get to this ambitious, but I think quite plausible vision in 2060? It's not going to be easy. I don't have a precise roadmap for how we'll get there, but I think we have some inkling of what's going to be needed. So especially in northern parts of the region, this is going to require substantial near-term public investment in the workforces and infrastructure needed to reinvigorate those forest-based economies and, crucially, reestablish low-grade markets to help boost our forests, bring them along towards a place where we can be taking more sawlogs relative to pulp. This might go hand in hand with the growth of outdoor recreation economies in parts of the region too. And it will also, as I alluded to earlier, require addressing some of those open questions surrounding what carbon markets do in these regions, and especially how the growing enrollment of large parcels might affect local economies and the tax revenue. So not to mention just the potential to perpetuate the leakage and therefore the illusion of preservation. So those are some of the northern industrial lands. As for public lands, I think achieving this 2060 vision really will require a widespread embracing by the public of the key role that public lands play, whether those are state lands, federal lands, or community forests. So our public lands can serve as models for that balanced approach in many ways to passive and active management. Both large and small, these tracts are really key anchors of our protected area networks, and they have disproportionately high ecological and social values. And they can, in many parts of our region, encompass big, vast wilderness areas, as well as smaller reserves. and active sustainable management to help meet our needs. So these lands are subject to long-term planning, considerable oversight, and certainly, as many of my public agency colleagues and yours as well know, increased public scrutiny. They can serve as training grounds for loggers and contractors who might then carry those good practices elsewhere, or as demonstrations for ecological forestry for landowners. And then crucially, as a place where the public can both explore wild places, as well as better understand what sustainable active forest management can look like, and appreciate where their wood comes from. And then finally, achieving this 2060 vision is going to require the engagement of family forest owners on an unprecedented scale. So imagine this, what we're looking at here is north central Massachusetts. And those lighter green parcels are state and conservation organization parcels. These, delineated by white, are the private parcels. And so after accounting for wildlands, we're envisioning about 50% of the remaining family forest ownerships in active ecological forestry. That's a lot. That's a lot of cats to herd if you look at all of these sort of sage-colored green parcels. That's nearly 3 million cords of wood that we're envisioning coming from these family forest ownerships, or about 35% of the region's productions. But there's precedent for that. So that's on par with the Victory Gardens of World War II, when American families generated over 1/3 of the nation's produce in their own gardens. So we need that scale of engagement. Victory woodlots, that's what Paul Catanzaro often calls this. That's what we need. And that's going to require a pretty substantial cultural shift, especially perhaps for southern parts of the region. It's maybe the trickiest part of moving beyond the illusion of preservation. And I would really love to hear your thoughts on some of the friction associated with this step in Rhode Island in particular. So to date, incentive programs have really failed to engage a substantial portion of family forest owners in active forest management. But we're not, of course, starting from scratch. There are many examples of family forest owners engaged in excellent active forest management, and many who seek to extend that stewardship and relationship to the land to many others, including through important neighbor-to-neighbor, peer-to-peer knowledge sharing networks and programs. So then just a few final comments in closing. Even though I see a lot of hope in especially those examples that I just gave a minute ago, the peer-to-peer, the neighbor-to-neighbor sharing, it is going to still require an enormous cultural shift to achieve the kind of vision that we're setting forth. And I think in many ways that's because we've lost sight of a few key things related to our relationship with the land and with one another. So first, these things that I do think we've lost sight of, in many ways we've lost sight of our old age reliance on forests and on wood, because it's just all too easy to hop onto Amazon, order a set of teak patio furniture, and then balk at the sight of a tree being harvested. Hardly any households in our urban and suburban parts of the region are tending their old woodlots anymore. And so as we've lost sight of that reliance, any logging, whether carried out in the context of ecological forestry or not, has really become anathema to many folks who would otherwise tout strong environmental values. And I think that's stoked by images of forest destruction on social media, and by the fact that, again, we've lost touch where many of these materials that we rely upon come from, and that we, in many cases, just use so carelessly. So imagine instead if we were to celebrate the production and use of local wood in the same way that we celebrate local agriculture. Another thing I think we've lost sight of is the interconnectedness and complexity of our world. And in some ways, that's a defense mechanism, because never before in the history of humanity have we been forced to confront planetary scale problems and the looming trade-offs and hidden unintended consequences of our actions or our inactions. And so in many ways, I'm tempted too, we're all tempted to just latch onto a single mantra, like maximize carbon here or bust, no more harvesting here or bust. But I think that simplicity really does obscure the complexity of our very deeply interconnected world. And that means that the notion of no harvesting or no active management is the most environmentally sound approach we can take, and that all harvesting, especially on public lands, ought to stop. I think that that notion, coupled with the tens of thousands of acres of forest we're losing every single year, is really only exacerbating the ethical and ecological costs in our deeply interconnected world, where natural resource consumption is just a fact of life. And then finally, the other thing I think we've lost sight of, and this is maybe the hardest one to swallow, is that we do indeed have common ground among all of us who are engaged in dialogue or debate around forest management, especially on our public lands, whether those are the diehard tree huggers or folks who have been in industry for generations. Our common ground is wanting this, a thriving forested landscape and communities long into the future. And I think the most assured way to achieve that is through the balanced approach that recognizes the complementarity and the necessity of both wild places and of managed places. So we need passively managed wildlands and actively ecologically managed woodlands, and we desperately need them both. And so in the spirit of finding that common ground, I'd like to end with quotes from these two guys on whose views on how to manage our public forests are often cast as pretty radically opposed, when in fact, I don't think they're so much at odds, and they really are consistent with the vision that we set forth here. So Gifford Pinchot on the right, the first chief of the Forest Service, who focused on multiple use and the greatest good for the greatest number. And then John Muir on the left, the founding father of our country's preservationist movement. So Muir said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, forest carbon, for example, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And Gifford Pinchot said, the vast possibility of our great future will become realities only if we make ourselves responsible for those realities. And so let us all take responsibility for the reality of New England's thriving forested landscapes and community into our shared future. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Really appreciate your taking the time to walk us through the study. All the the different nuances of the three parts of it, then bringing us back to the big picture. And now we will have some time for Q&A and discussion. May make sense. There we go. Come back to this view again, and we can talk about it. I'll just start out with one question. I'm wondering, since the release of the report and talks like this and press releases and so forth, what kinds of reactions have been coming in from around the region or beyond?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that it is very likely that the reactions I've received are filtered to be mostly the I'm not getting a lot of grumpy emails. I'm getting mostly like, this is what we need, this is great kind of emails. But I do think that there is so in general, I think especially from here in Vermont, speaking here in Vermont, that especially our public land managers this has been very well received and a necessary call out of some of the trade-offs and some of the unintended consequences of these mounting pressures to curtail harvesting. But there are a number of folks who are really pretty grumpy about how, reasonably so, I understand, about thinking that we, even in using the term illusion of preservation, that's not something that we're very intentional about retaining that and keeping it in quotes, as I said, but that I think some folks feel like we are hobbling efforts to advance more wildlands by even retaining this terminology. So that's been a source of contention. And then there have been many folks who, I think, especially from northern reaches of the region, and again, I don't always hear this, and so some of this is filtered through Tony that I've gotten this feedback on too, that there are a lot of folks, especially from industry, who are really skeptical around this kind of vision. And really, ecological forest management everywhere, not going to happen. Really, reduced production, what is that? How could you possibly be calling for that for these communities? So it's been a mixed bag, but I think all told, it's been the net balance has been positive. And I'll also say that our intention here wasn't to make everybody happy. I think our intention here was to give everybody a little bit of heartburn in many ways, because it's challenging to whatever side that you're sitting on of the equation. So anyway, long answer to your question, Christopher. I think it's been a little bit of a mixed bag, but again, mostly what I've been hearing, especially from our public land partners and colleagues, has been that this is a very helpful thing to have out there. But I welcome any and all criticism and critiques and virtual tomatoes thrown. I'd really love to hear that.
Well, one of the places where it makes me go or think about is, where the lowest sort of hanging fruit would be, and trying to move the needle on this vision, and where that would be in Rhode Island, would be different from Maine, or more northern parts of the region, and how we might start towards that. So that would be a kind of open discussion sort of question.
Well, I have one thought, and then a couple of questions. I guess the first one is, at one point you said something about we could meet our construction needs because the population isn't growing very fast. But the real issue with housing development is actually demography, not population. I mean, in Rhode Island, the population has gone up by single digits in more than 30 years, and the number of housing units has gone up by a quarter, by 25%. So that's a demographic problem, and until we figure out, like the number of housing units per person or people per housing unit is just changing radically because of demographics. So I think that's one question. And the other question I had was really related to the practicality of looking at a model that uses smaller forestry units or operations. I mean, one of the reasons that forestry, like agriculture, has moved away from the East is because the economics of production relies on sort of mass production of identical units, of consolidation and centralization, and you can't have the same economics of a forestry operation in Maine and in Rhode Island, because the costs are completely impractical. I mean, you can't do forestry economically in Rhode Island on quarter-acre lots. It's not going to happen. And so from a practical point of view, like, this is all great from like a theoretical point of view, but I feel like from a practical point of view, you're at a risk of getting yourself into a dead end. That's my observation.
Yeah, thanks, David. I appreciate that. Let me tackle that first one, comment on that first. And I do acknowledge that, exactly as you put it, theoretically, philosophically, this might all sound good, but really where the rubber hits the road is, I don't know, in some of these contexts. So totally acknowledge that. I also feel like we are at such a crisis point that we've got to start throwing spaghetti at the wall, and like really hopeful spaghetti at the wall, and see how we can make it stick. So I totally acknowledge that pragmatic question, and I don't have all the answers about how to exactly get to this vision. But to your first question, the optimist in me and about that shifting demography, and yeah, it's astonishing how much more house each person has relative to historically. I even among my peers, I'm a late millennial, early, I don't know, I'm almost not a millennial, whatever that means. I've seen so many more of us seeking more communal living situations, shared housing. I live in a duplex. I live within walking distance to our village. I just have this hope that people are going to be understanding and embracing more of a consolidated living, shared living situation where we have vibrant reestablishments of our downtowns and old mill areas and houses closer to public transit lines, which can counteract the loneliness epidemic too, not to mention our loss of forests. So I kind of wrap it all into one, and that's where I have some hope that can we shrink down, or can we live more in a more shared communal way? Can we have smaller footprints using local wood? And oh, by the way, because we're using less, we can protect these areas and don't have to develop them more. So I know that goes right back in the bucket of what you described as theoretical and not very practical, but I have that little glimmer of hope around how we envision our built landscape and what that can mean for our own well-being and for our forests. So I'll just mention that, but then to your other point about the economics and how there's just, it's a quarter-acre lot, no way, that's not going to happen. And we acknowledge that. That won't necessarily happen. But what we do need to see is a greater consumer willingness to pay a premium for the wood that is coming out, that ecological forest management will that alone, no matter the size of the parcels, is going to likely cost more or not be as immediately lucrative as industrial scale and larger scale. And so we do need to see a greater consumer willingness to pay for those kind of wood products. And I think we also need to recognize that that's where some investments can go as well, public investments to reward the kind of practices that we need to see, or to facilitate those supply chains, that there's, you know, a Alaskan mill that gets ported around and helps you harvest the two, or, you know, process the 2 trees you have coming off your backyard. Those sort of possibilities, which very reasonably you'd say that's not pragmatic. I get that. But I don't know. Those are the hopes I might have. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I mean, it sounds like, you know, sort of vegetable production, let's say, is a decade or more ahead of you in experimenting with the economics of local production. And, you know, people are definitely critical of that. Like, you know, you drive your Tesla to the farmer's market and buy $8 head of lettuce, and then Aldi comes into town selling God knows what because nobody else can afford to shop at the farmer's market. So, you know, I think there's lessons probably there, and they're a little ahead on the curve compared to the wood market. And yeah, so I think having anthropology, you know, this is where you need to bring anthropologists and demographers and resource economists into this, because I think that yeah, there's going to be technological solutions, like traveling around with a mill to mill everybody's small logs is great, except the guy who milled for me wouldn't mill anything that was like within 50 feet of the field edge, because it might have wire in it. And if every woodlot is tiny, it's nothing but edge. And so, you know, but maybe there's a technological solution. Maybe there's, you know, like titanium saw blades you can use or something. I don't know. But it's like this multi-level problem where you're going to have to start tackling it with all these different disciplines. It's interesting for sure.
That's where I often land. It's interesting. It's a fun challenge, but you're right though. I do think, to your point about bringing in different disciplines, the anthropologist, the resource economist, the indigenous voice, which we are woefully lacking in this work here. But yeah, that's how I'm trying to see this, as a fun challenge to tackle, not an intractable one. But I think that looking to your point about especially local vegetable production being a model to look at, I agree with that. The one thing that I'm still mulling over is, how do we, you know, you can plant a carrot and have it ready in a few weeks and yoink it up, and then there's your beautiful carrot. But that's not this time scale that we operate on with forests and forestry as well. And so I think that is a tricky part that I have yet to resolve, that use of the analogy of local vegetable production and local forestry production, because there is just an inherent, you got to wait a few decades kind of thing.
Are there other parts of the, you know, the world that we, you know, might look to, or that, you know, people talk about as a model for this? I've, you know, heard about woodland, you know, cooperatives in Mexico, you know, for example, or you know, forestry and, you know, more some of the both densely populated and forested parts of Europe. But I wonder what the discussion's like around that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Christopher. And there are a couple co-ops even up here too that I'm, and I don't know if they exist in Rhode Island as well, but to your point about that's the potential for pooling those resources. That still probably, I mean, the prospect of getting, you know, a couple dozen quarter acre lot owners together to try to do something is probably impossible to get everybody on the same page. But for larger parcels that are in between where it's not quite economical, maybe that could be a really valuable model. I don't know enough about elsewhere across the globe, but that's a great point, that we should be looking beyond simply our little borders here.
One area we haven't really been talking about quite yet is our state lands, our public lands in Rhode Island, and the fact that we're managing about 1% a year for what we have. and we really we haven't invested as a state in staffing and the funds we need to be doing both larger an increase in our forestry operation, but potentially also considering designating some wildlands as well. There's a real opportunity there, and it's a bunch of land. So maybe this is an opportunity to utilize this research, or pick your brain about how we can sort of adapt like exactly this information to who we need to be talking to on the state level to try to like increase our access and availability of these resources.
Yeah, it's interesting you say 1% is treated each year. Yeah, that's not unlike even I think Green Mountain National Forest up here. It's a tiny fraction of what yields some of our products anyway. I'm just curious, what is the rhetoric or the general prevailing conversation like in Rhode Island? Is there a strong pro-forestation contingent that would really push back on that?
So there, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of energy around recognizing our forests as important. In 2021, the General Assembly passed the Forest Conservation Act saying forests are important. We should figure out how to conserve them. We should figure out the right way to manage them and how to get private landowners resources. And with that came the establishment of a committee, and we've been all working for the last nearly 2 years on defining what the most important forests are, looking at funding sources and opportunities, and trying to figure out what to do. So that's really good energy, really good, you know, public support for forests and recognizing they're important. There is also a big pro-forestation contingent. There's a few really loud voices, and there's a group of people that have gained some traction, lots of public meetings recently in libraries on old growth forests. They've brought forth legislation the last couple of years that hasn't gone anywhere. So it's kind of a mix. We're sort of in the middle. Again, it's like a couple really loud voices, but everyone else is sort of understanding what is going on in the background.
But I think, Kate, you were also, I sort of intuit that you were also inferring one of the reasons that there's so much sort of grumbling among the ranks is that there's not enough resources in the agencies to move faster on some of the decisions that could help sort of tamp down that. And I think that's the resource, the sort of, well, we'd love to respond to you, but we don't have enough resources. And that just throws gas on the fire.
But it's a fire initially stoked by the few loud voices, though, but then somehow that resonates with
Yeah. And we should now that we're talking about fire, we should also throw that in here. We did have a fire last April that was pretty significant. Initial reports were over 500 acres. It turned out to be about 250 in the southwestern part of the state. No homes were damaged, but a significant amount of forest land was affected, both on private and the Nature Conservancy's properties, which then turned into a Forest Fire Study Commission and several bills related to forest management that have been heard at the General Assembly this year. So people, especially in rural Rhode Island, are really thinking about how fire is going to be affecting them and what that means for management or not management. So.
Yeah, that question, especially the question of fire, of pests and diseases, of what, you know, we're just facing a breathtaking amount of ecological loss and change. And if that can be the motivating factor for helping people get in there and do the management that some of these overstocked, disease declining stands need to reduce the risk of higher severity fire, or at least nudging up that severity, whatever fire is coming down the pike, or reduce drought risk. I don't know, but it takes the experience of, to your point, Kate, like that fire to initiate the commission and the study, to initiate people having this on their radar. But then if something doesn't burn for another 10 years, that just drifts, which, but Brendan, excuse me, go ahead. I see you have a comment.
I was just going to follow up on what Kate said. So the Richmond, Rhode Island was the epicenter of the gypsy moth defoliation that occurred along the Atlantic seaboard about 4 or 5 years ago now. And so a lot of the forest landowners that I talk to through my work have this kind of profound sense of loss that, you know, all their trees have died. And then the beech leaf disease is moving very quickly through the state. And so, you know, it's a tough moment for sure.
Yeah, I would, if any of you have figured out how to manage or deal with the heartache that is coming down the pike for so many, I would take your thoughts. But that's, yeah, thanks for sharing that, Brendan. That's not easy.
But I do feel that we're compared to our neighbors, the dialogue, you know, even as hot as it can get sometimes, be, you know, less contentious here just because of the small size of the state. You know, it's in our, you know, the metropolitan Providence area is smaller. The, you know, the rural areas are closer, so it's harder to be you know, totally unaware of you know, managed lands if you know, live in the city, or you know, what's going on in the urban areas if you're, you know, in the rural parts of Rhode Island. You know, you do hit up against the, you know, the issues of scale, you know, as David, you know, was speaking to quickly. I guess I work, you know, on the sort of the climate, you know, parts of forestry, you know, quite a bit now. So I'm attuned to that, but that is something that I feel like Rhode Islanders are, you know, fairly, you know, dialed into, and that's added a new element to the conversation about forests and why you might or might not manage them. That you know, maybe a game changer in some ways. But it seems like having the, you know, discussions like this these are the first steps of what we can do.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. I hope so. I mean, with this work, we really have tried to set forth a balance and add some of that nuance to that conversation, which I think everybody here and in so many circles recognize. But it is, to Kate's point a minute ago, you know, it's a few loud voices on either side that just can end up really polarizing these conversations. And I don't know, I do feel like there's a lot more common ground out there than we can appreciate. But maybe to your point about the smallness of Rhode Island, and there is more common ground simply by nature of, yeah, that you go from the urban to rural gradient in a small city to the rural gradient so much more quickly. So it's that relationship that I do have a lot of faith in, I think.
Have you heard of any or a lot of talk about sort of against fuel wood, heating with wood? I've heard more and more people say that that's sort of counter to what we want to do environmentally. And the reason I think it's worth thinking about is because firewood is it's kind of like the product of last resort. And you sort of said, you know, like, you know, production equals consumption, but with a lot of the wood around here, that's kind of what you can do with it. And if there were, so you know, on the one hand, you might say, oh yeah, so encouraging people to heat with wood would be great because we could use up all this wood you can't saw into lumber. But then there's more and more noise that I hear about, and I don't mean to say noise in a bad way, because some of them are good arguments, but about using fuel to heat with.
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly one that's a hot debate up here. And it was even a debate among the author group in this report too. So first off, I do think that, yes, to your point about a lot of the wood and the lower grade material that we have and that we need to, in many cases, we need to remove, a lot can be left in the woods too. Like that's okay. But when it comes to needing to have some revenue associated with whether it's commercial or non-commercial harvest, of course, that's, you know, you need to be able to have revenue from something else. So I do want to acknowledge that, but I think that we need the lower grade markets stimulated a bit more, but we also can leave wood in the woods too. But in terms of your precise question, yes. So there's, you know, Burlington, Vermont, we get all of our Burlington gets all of its electricity from the McNeil biomass plant, and it's not a cogeneration plant. There's no heating going on there. There's been endless debates for years around trying to funnel that waste heat up the hill to the University of Vermont. But increasingly, because of these concerns around biomass use as this terrible thing for the climate, those have really been stalled. My reaction is, and so most of my master's work was on the impacts of biomass harvesting on forest stand structure and habitat. And in general, it's an avenue for getting wood. It helps pay to get wood. Those margins can help pay to get wood out of the woods. And so I think there's recognizing the whole systems approach of that there's, if you are able to continue to use this parcel for forestry because you're generating revenue off of it, then it means it's not going to get sold or converted. So there's one kind of like the long-term scale aspect of continuing to make sure that forest provides value, and those lower grade materials and markets are a place to do so. I also, and we maintained thanks, Christopher. Yeah, we maintained in this report anyway, we're not coming for anybody's wood stoves. I am not getting rid of my wood stove. We're very clear about saying that especially in rural areas, we would continue to anticipate ongoing wood heating, even at smaller municipal scales, campuses, schools, municipal buildings. But we do generally need to be moving towards more renewable sources like solar and wind, but we certainly can accommodate that. And I don't know that we should be shuttering our power plants when we've got a very clear pipeline and forests that need the work. I don't think we should be shuttering those just in the name of keeping the carbon in that biomass in the woods. I'd rather be burning wood than fossil fuels right now, even as we work our way towards more renewable sources. So there's a lot that's a big pushback piece, I don't just mean in this report, but in general, a lot of folks are really getting up in arms around using biomass. They're mostly getting up in arms about using biomass municipally, but you talk to anybody about their wood stove, they don't want to get rid of it. And so I think that's one of those challenges as well of, you know, kind of a NIMBYism approach to what wood energy is. Are there biomass plants in Rhode Island or municipal biomass plants at all?
There's one high school that is or was heated by biomass. That's in rural Western Rhode Island. That's the one that I can think of off the top of my head.
I think, I mean, some of the worst, sort of most effective counter arguments that I heard about it was really that, and again, this comes back to the economics of wood production, that biomass plants up here are being fueled by bulk harvested, you know, wood in North Carolina, South Carolina, where they just feed whole forests into grinders and produce pellets or something. So it is more about your local. I mean, the reason they do that is because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to make, you know, pellets in North Carolina and ship them up here than it is to use local wood. So it sort of speaks to that problem. But I think I'm not, and I don't know about that. I haven't really researched this, but I'm thinking that if that were the issue, you'd want to be specific about locally produced biomass.
Thank you for that. That's a very good distinction.
Or yes, even biomass that's ancillary to something else. Like when they trim the highway verges back, they produce, can't even imagine how much material. And that's just going to be thrown away anyway. So you might as well burn it.
I think you're right. In my experience, I've never seen at least here in Vermont anyway, there's never been a purely biomass harvest. It's almost always been that additional material. So to your point, that stuff that's coming down anyway. or that additional margin. But yeah, that's a really good, I'm grateful you said that. The emphasis here needs to be on it's local. We should not be, I think parts of the South are shipping logs to England and other parts of Europe to be able to meet their fuel reduction targets, their fossil fuel reduction targets. That is insane to me. That does not make sense. That is a system gone wrong. But yes, keeping it local, right? I think that makes sense.
Well, thanks so much, Caitlin. Really appreciate your joining us, for the talk and being up for participating in the robust discussion. I think it's, fascinating how there's so many different angles or parts of this that you can examine, and that we collectively may focus on and in different ways in our own work now or in the future. And it's important for this this study to get work, to have the dialogue and discussion here in in southern New England and some of the states that are we've got good, we're more than half forested still here in Rhode Island, but to have them here as well as in other parts of the region. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. I really enjoy this kind of conversation, and I'm glad you get to share this work, and would welcome any further thoughts and ideas. And yeah, thanks a bunch.
We'll continue on with our meeting. We can get into our, talking about Rhode Island forest policy and updates, and welcome to stick around and know that you have, plenty of other things to do as well. But really appreciate, again, you joining us this afternoon.
Yeah. Thanks, Christopher. I'll jump back to the old inbox, but many thanks again for having me here. Nice to meet you all.
Sure.
So, okay, take care.
All right. Well, we can sort of shift over, kind of get into the updates portion of our meeting, and this is usually where we talk about sort of policy and legislative topics before we get into more general updates. So why don't we start there? Kate, you may be the one who's closest to the flame here to start us off.
So Rep. Cotter introduced a package of bills related to forestry. One of them just moved through committee. It was a bill that would require, it started off as a bill that would require every private landowner with over 500 acres to have a forest management plan that contained some wildfire recommendations. That bill got amended to sort of be completely watered down, and now it sort of says the fire department and DEM will sort of work together on fire plans. So I don't know if that's actually going to make it across the governor's desk. In the hearing, some private property owners were like, well, we're already sort of doing this, and two, this is totally unenforceable. So how does this work? So that's one thing. Megan was also hoping to get 10 full-time equivalents to DFE. And I think Senator Ujifusa had a companion bill. I haven't seen that move. The other one is the funding in the green bond. We are seeking an additional $16 million that would have funding for conservation in it. For some background, the current green bond has no money for conservation in it. And what we're seeking is $16 million that would be split. $5 million for farmland conservation, $5 million for state open space funds, $3 million for the local open space grant program, and $3 million to go to DFE to do forest management work on state lands. The budget comes out tomorrow. You vote on it tomorrow. So everything is sort of up in the air. We don't have information. All we keep hearing is we'll probably get something. It's probably not going to be all 16. But what does that mean? What are they going to take money? What pot are they going to take money away from? The scuttlebutt sort of in the background is that a case is being made that the local open space funds should not be funded because when municipalities protect land, it prevents affordable housing. We all know that that's not actually the case. And the 11 open space grants that were just funded are evidence that that's not the case. The 300-acre wetland that Audubon conserved is not exactly where we're going to be doing any affordable housing work. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. Trying to think of any other forestry related bills. I've been working on the conservation and housing trust fund. That's the bill that was passed that models Vermont, passed into law in 1990, and then nothing happened. We had really good hearings and good suggestions for how to make that bill better. And surprisingly, the builders got behind it the way it was written, and actually had really good suggestions for amendments to make sure we're including more diverse people on the board if it gets selected. I hope that it goes somewhere. It's not likely to go somewhere, but I think that having that bill in play this year is a big win, because it shows that we are actually trying to figure out how to do both things together. And we have built relationships with community developers and other organizations that are working on addressing the affordability issue and the housing crisis that we all know is a real thing. Any other big, Old Growth Forest Act is, as far as I know, hasn't gone anywhere. I know that Phoenix Wheeler from Audubon have been helping Nathan to sort of like pare down that original 14-page 31-page bill into something that people who care a lot about forests can agree on. Haven't seen the end result of that. We're at the last 2 weeks of the session, so that's not a thing that's going to be happening again. We know it'll come up next year. I don't know what to say.
One we haven't
Yeah.
talked about yet is the forest sort of parity bill that would put
Yeah.
Oh.
I haven't heard anything on it.
Okay.
So the hearings were interesting. There were some folks that were testifying against the Forest Parity Act because they claim that by providing benefits to loggers, that it will just increase the amount of logging happening across the board in Rhode Island. And, it's all the same old growth people that testified on that. Yeah, I haven't heard about anything going on with that at all. Thank you, Christopher. I didn't even think to add that to my list. I think that's it. Bond, fire, old growth. So yeah, what happens is they start talking about the budget at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Sounds terrible. And they'll pass it out of the House, and then it has to sit on the speaker's desk for a week. So it's likely that the session will end on the 14th when they all pat each other on the back for passing a budget. So it's going to be chaos for the next 24 hours, and then we'll all just be hopefully aware of what will be happening next.
Well, thank you, Kate, for the update. It's something that there's been a fair amount to monitor on forest related bills this year.
Yeah, that's true.
Kate, that first bill that you mentioned about forest fire protection, is that 500-acre clause still in there?
I don't think so, Rich. I think it's like out. Well, the last time I checked it, so I don't know. I heard that DM wasn't in favor of how the first bill was written at the end, but I don't really know the ins and outs of like why. And then the last time I checked it, I was like, oh, this doesn't have any of that in it. So I don't know what the concern is. It's just sort of a suggestion.
Okay.
But maybe that's a question for TJ, or I can find the bill number and put it in the chat. It just seemed totally pared down. It didn't seem like it was much of anything.
Okay, thanks.
Well, at this point, unless anybody's got anything else they'd like to talk about specifically related to the legislation or policy, we can just move into our more general updates. If anybody has one, feel free to chime in on yours or your organization's work.
I'll say that BioBlitz is coming up a week from tomorrow. We have 390 people registered. It's basically a sellout. And I don't know where we're going to park everybody. So if you're registered and coming to BioBlitz, carpool. So if you, and you know, we're going to get a good look at a very rare forest type, which is red maple forest with a privet understory. It should be pretty interesting. But anyway, that's what we're doing here, basically 24/7 right now. Except when I'm talking to you all, and I just can't miss a Woodland partnership meeting.
Well, we appreciate your contributions, and that's great. The participation that you're getting in the BioBlitzes in these years, very encouraging.
Our annual meeting is June 24th at Tilted Barn. It's going to be really fun. You should all come. There's going to be a really cool silent auction with awesome prizes. Not prizes because it's an auction, but like you can, bid on staying in the Nature Conservancy's house in the off season. There's all sorts of stuff. So
is there a speaker?
The current CEO of the Land Trust Alliance, which is the national organization, will be saying a few words, which would be pretty cool too. Thank you, Christopher.
Nice. Oh, look forward to the new model. Come on down. I'll pass along just an update in the sort of Hillsdale Preserve Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project. I think all of you guys are familiar with, or indeed have worked on now. The treatments, 3 experimental treatments, have been implemented over the for the past few months, especially during the winter, and we just finished planting 256 oak seedlings, for native species adapted to the sort of rocky upland, growing conditions, and 4 species that are not native to Rhode Island at this time that might see good growing conditions in future decades. And sort of the public outreach and education is a part of this project, and it's going to be the site for our June Rhode Island Woodland Partnership field tour on the afternoon of June 20th, going back to our typical third Thursday. So hope that some of you may be able to come on out and join us. We'll also be going there for the RIFCO's summer twilight walk later in the summer on August 8th. So just fresh off of doing the initial measurements of the seedlings this week. Anyone else for updates?
Yeah, our board is in the process of approving another 5-year contract with the Northern Rhode Island Conservation District, and we've enjoyed over 30 years with them. Wonderful group of people, and so looking forward to continuing that. We're also advertising for a position. Does not require a forestry degree, but environmental science degree with an emphasis on forestry. So if anybody knows of anybody that might be interested, you can either just Google it or go to our website to find out more. And I guess we're having some interesting opportunities with some beavers and some historic mill ponds. So if anybody has any resources they could steer me towards as far as pond levelers, any tried and true techniques and dealing with those critters, that would be appreciated.
You should talk to the Cumberland Land Trust. They use beaver deceivers.
I just heard that or learned that yesterday. So yeah, I guess that's well worth pursuing. Cumberland Land Trust. Thanks.
Well, that's encouraging about the position too, Rich. Hope you're able to share it, on the some of the Society of American Foresters or Environmental Science Jobs website, places like that, where it'll people will be able to see it.
Yeah, it's long overdue, but thankfully we're going in that direction now.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Well, if there aren't further updates, we'll conclude here. Kate, looks like you might have one more.
It's Brendan's birthday.
Happy birthday, Brendan.
Happy birthday.
Thank you all. That's very kind.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you for joining us on your birthday. Good time. Glad to have all of you with us this afternoon, including those we had earlier. So we'll convene again on June 20th for that field tour. As always, receptive to suggestions for future virtual meetings, walks. Looking at planning out the coming months during the second half of the year. But thanks again for joining us, and hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.